it's a pleasure to welcome her making her debut for Torah Motion, Rabbanit Nechama Barash Goldman. And I really invited her because I just read her book recently. I forget what it's called.
Uncovered.
Uncovered, that's right. It's a book on Sniut, women's. It's a really fascinating book. And I read the book, and we were in contact a few years ago, and somehow it just never worked out. And after I read the book, I got in contact with her again, although she's not talking about anything on the book. They'll have to wait for another
Wait for another
They'll
series.
have to wait for another series. Okay, very quickly. Rabbanit Barash Goldman, who grew up in Philadelphia, a little bit of a Phillies fan, I don't know, teaches at Matan. She teaches Halakha at Matan, Torah V'dat, Amudim, Pardes. I think she's the educational director. She's a Yoetzet Halakha, graduate of the Nishmat program, and has been teaching Torah for many years in Israel, and she lives in Elazar in Gush Etzion, and it's a pleasure to welcome her. This is a short little series to get started. Vakasha, Rabbanit Nechama, it's all yours.
Okay, hi, how are you doing, everyone? Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Nice to see familiar faces and new faces. So I'm going to share my screen. The source sheet was sent to you, and we're going to get started. And as we learn together, I'll talk a little bit about the arc of this series. So this week, we're going to be more immersed in really methodology of halakha. We're going to be in the Talmud. We're going to be looking at various texts to understand the halakhic principle of Kavod HaBeriyot, or the idea that human dignity at times may be relied upon to override some commandment. Next week, we'll be focusing more on case studies, which to me is always the more fascinating material, but both are necessary in order to have an awareness of what Kavod HaBeriyot is about. I'm actually going to start somewhere else, though, today. We're coming out of Yom HaShoah, and what I'd like to start with are a few responsa that were written at the time of Shoah. They were published afterwards by a rabbi named Ephraim Oshri. He wrote a series, it's actually, I think, 5 volumes in Hebrew, called Mima Amakim, Out of the Depths. I often teach this around the time of Shoah, Yom HaShoah. And what I'd like to focus on before we begin going 2,000 years backward to the Talmudic discussions is where the ideas of human dignity, or what is human dignity, and not just how the Talmud experiences it, but how we as human beings experience it. And of course, the idea of dignity is something unique to human beings. Animals don't have dignity. And as we learn together, we'll see there's something very undefined, because the dignity for one person is not always the same as the dignity for another. There are 3 areas in which there is unanimous consensus that human beings seek dignity in these three expressions of humanness. The first one is nakedness. Human beings do not appear, for the most part, right, in society without clothing. We know from the story of Adam and Eve that one of the first acts of kindness God did to them after they become aware of their nakedness is God clothes them. There's a play on words there with ayin or aleph. Is it clothing that's made of skins or of light? And I believe it's Rabbi Meir who uses the aleph and says he clothed them in light. One of the first acts that God bestows upon the human being is to clothe them. The second is the bathroom, that human beings are seek privacy and cleanliness and hygiene when they use the bathroom, when they discard of their wastes. We know that too is a mitzvah, that if you're at war, you must have a little shovel with you to bury your waste, because it is meant to tamp down or quench some of the animalistic behavior that comes out at a time of war, and remind the soldier that even at war, they must maintain a certain level of dignity. And the third is around death, the idea that we respect our dead, we give dignity to the dead, we wash the body, we clothe the body, we bury the body. And so some of what I'm talking about is unique to Jewish practice, but much of it is universal with every culture, every religion, every society seeking some form of dignity with regard to clothing, with regard to death, with regard to the bathroom. So what I want to look at very quickly, because we are not going to have enough time, there's never enough time, but what I want to look at are some of these responsa, because the four that I brought touch on, even at the time of Shoah, the drive for dignity, the drive to seek some form of order within the chaos, and using the lens of halakha to achieve that. The first question, we're not going to read the whole question, and you have it on your source sheet. Some of it you can do on your own. Many of these questions are in 1941 in Lithuania. Rabbi Osheri is 27 years old. I just want us to think, for those of us who know what 27-year-olds are like, many of them are doctors, are lawyers, and so on. But to have the emotional, mental, spiritual capacity to hold this kind of unthinkable destruction and devastation is very impressive. And as he's teaching, someone runs in and talks about the murder of this. A woman runs in. She says her 3 sons have been murdered together with her husband. The grandfather, Rabbi Zalman, is sitting right there learning. He falls off his chair and dies, very reminiscent of Eli in the time of Shmuel, when he hears his 2 sons, Hofni and Pinchas, are killed in battle. He too is sitting on a chair and falls backward and dies from the heartbreak. And the director of the Chevra Kadisha, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Kaplan, turns to Rav Osheri and says, right now we have the bodies, but we don't know when the burial will be. And normally a tahara, the cleansing of the body, is done adjacent to the burial so that nothing contaminates the body between the tahara and the burial. But with the Germans, who knows? It could be days. We don't even know if they'll allow a burial. Are we permitted to perform the tahara? And so his question is it simply permissible to make the tahara in advance? He permitted immediate tahara. But this idea that in these moments, turning to halakha, to the rabbi for some sort of direction so that we can maintain the dignity of death that we're so committed to. That's number one. The second one I want to bring is about garments. It's about clothing. And here the question becomes, the murderers take out, the Nazis take out a group of men. They ordered the Jews to dig a grave for the corpses and remove the garments of the dead as a gift for the Jews who dug the grave. So you have Jews, burying other Jews, and they're instructed or commanded to remove the garments so they can take them home as a token of appreciation. And so Rav Osheri is asked whether the garments which had no bloodstains on them, it suggests they were shot in the head as opposed to in the body, could they be put to much needed use? Or is it forbidden? Do they have to be buried with the body? What do we do? These are sacred, holy garments. The halacha is you're supposed to be buried as soon as possible. You're supposed to be buried as you're found. If you're found murdered without burial shrouds, not even the shoes are to be removed. But what he says here, and this I highlighted, since the dead men had already been buried without their garments, in other words, because they were being guarded, they had to remove the garments, undress the bodies, bury them, and now they have this pile of clothing that had been last worn by those who had been murdered. And what does he write? The greatest pleasure one could provide them was to allow their surviving children to benefit from these garments, either by wearing them to warm themselves or by selling them in order to purchase food for survival. Having clothing could be the difference between life and death. Having something to hold on to protect yourself from the elements, to cover your nakedness, was essential for survival. And so that's another tshuva that to me touches on the broader topic, what does human dignity look like? The next question is one of the hardest. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but a German notices a very pregnant woman. He shoots her in the head, and a Jewish obstetrician rushes over, and he tells the rabbi, if surgery is performed immediately, the baby could be saved. Are you allowed to desecrate the body of the dead woman to save the baby? Now, For those who have learned Mesechet Sanhedrin, we know Beferush there's a situation that is brought here, I think also in Erchin, about performing a cesarean on a dead woman on Shabbat. Is that permitted? The answer is yes. But here, notice their concern when saving a life is involved. We are not concerned with the desecration of the dead. That also is an important synergy. The idea that we uphold the dignity of the dead, but if there is a pikuach nefesh situation, if there's a possibility of saving the life of the unborn child, he says the mother would be overjoyed if desecration of her body meant her baby's life would be spared. Unfortunately, the Nazis come along, find the baby, and murder the baby as well. The last one I want to bring you, and that will segue into our beginning the learning we're going to do, is someone comes to Rav Osheri and said, should we be saying Shelo Asani Aved? Should we be saying the blessing, God who has not made me a slave? Because look at us, right? We're enslaved, he says. Is it forbidden to alter the prayer service? And what does Rav Osheri write? He writes, we are not only praising God for our physical liberty, but for our spiritual liberty. On the contrary, despite our physical captivity, we were more obligated than ever to recite the blessing, to demonstrate to our enemies that even if physically we were slaves, as a people, we remain spiritually free. So the broader topic of how we seek to uphold our dignity through the lens of halakha is what we're going to be examining. What I wanted to start out with is, as I said, these three subcategories: nakedness, desecration, or the body, upholding the dead body. I'm about to tell an anecdote about the bathroom. Those are things that are constantly on our minds whenever we are in fraught situations, and I wanted to show how it played out in responsa as a way of tying it to the time of year that we're in. And just as an aside, one of the things Rav Udi Schwartz, who is the chief rabbi of the army, wrote recently is there have been tens of thousands of shailas, of Halakhic questions asked since October 7th began, an unprecedented amount of Halakhic questions for men and women who are at war. And to me, there's something very moving about that. A lot had to do in the beginning with care for the dead, how we are going to maintain and uphold the standards we need to uphold with the conditions of the bodies that they were finding. I will tell one anecdote. I know it's the Yortzeit of Rav Lichtenstein, and there have been shiurim, and Torah in Motion is going to be adding some shiurim about Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. And this anecdote ties to the third category, for which I did not find a Holocaust responsa. So it's a more uplifting story, which is something I like to end with. My colleague, Rabbi Morty Friedman, called my attention to it, that during the Yom Kippur War broke out on Yom Kippur, and they started evacuating the students onto buses. And the students were told to only take what was most necessary. It's Yom Kippur. So whatever they absolutely needed for the evacuation. And Rav Lichtenstein came running out with a big container of toilet paper. And I quote, Gam ze chashuv, ze Kavod HaBeriyot. This too is important. Don't forget to take toilet paper with you. This is human dignity. So I've even managed to tie in, and it gives me a little bit that I love that vision. And I remember Rav Lichtenstein well, the idea that he was not so above the mundane everyday to ignore the real, the reality of the human body, the needs of the human body, and that human beings are driven to maintain a certain degree of discretion and privacy and modesty in that area. And toilet paper, of course, is essential for that maintenance. We're going to start, now we're starting the shiur. It's 1:15 or 8:15, depending on where you are, maybe another time, depending on where you are. And we are now going to dive into some of the Talmudic discussions. And what I hope at least to get through, because I'm always very ambitious, is the Tosefta, the Yerushalmi, the Bavli, right, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. And I want to talk a little bit about the undefined nature and the concern that allowing human dignity to be a tool in halakhic decision-making can actually be very dangerous. Okay, we're going to see. Rabbi Meir Omer, bo r'eh chaviva melacha, lifnei mi she'amar v'haya ha'olam, haya olam. Shor mibnei shebat lo mimelachato mishalem chamisha, sem mibnei she'en lo melacha mishalem arba'a. Okay, so Rabbi Meir says something very interesting. Come and see how great it is. Chaviva melacha, that working is something that God desires. It's something that God wants us to do. Because when a thief steals a sheep, and sheep aren't used to plow fields, meaning you shear the sheep, you might eat the sheep, you might milk the sheep, but the sheep is not a tool of labor in the way that an oxen is. And Rabbi Meir suggests that because labor is so valued in the eyes of the Lord, that you actually pay the higher fee for a fivefold payment for the ox, which causes the owner to cease his laboring. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai goes in a different direction, and that's really where we're starting. I always like to bring a whole text so you see the context. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Omer, bo urei kama chas hamakom al Kavod HaBeriyot. Now, this is really probably the earliest mention of the idea of human dignity. It's a very peculiar one, as you will see. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, come and see how great is Kavod HaBeriyot, human dignity. Why? Sure, mishalem. He goes again, the ox is a fivefold payment. The sheep is a fourfold payment. Why do you pay less when you steal a sheep than when you steal an ox? He says, because you lead the ox by its collar, by a rope, however it is, and there's nothing undignified about pulling an ox. I might argue if the ox refuses to go with you, you might look a little undignified, but okay. A sheep, because you have to throw it over your shoulders, you look ludicrous. It impinges, it impairs your human dignity, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and so you pay a lesser price as compensation. Now remember, he's a thief. He's a thief. And yet, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai suggests his lowering his dignity in order to steal buys him a onefold, if you will. Okay, that's really the first place we see it. It has no real practical implication. It's more that I want to show you the first mention. And here, human dignity is something other than bathroom nakedness and death. It's the sensation of embarrassment, of shame, of looking foolish. And this is where I'll ask us to begin to think, what does it mean to have, let's say I'm fully clothed. I can use the bathroom with the door closed and have some privacy. I know my Chevra Kadisha functions well. Where is Kavod HaBeriyot going to meet me? Where might there be situations where I am conflicted or I feel embarrassed, ashamed about my behavior to the degree that perhaps I'm able to override halacha? That's what we're going to be talking. And that is much less defined. Bathroom nakedness, death are much easier to quantify. What Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is talking about is a very subjective experience, because it could be the farmer regularly walks around with a sheep around his shoulders, and people do not jeer or mock or stare. But the thief, who may not be a farmer, who might be a stranger, is going to look very bizarre. I will say I don't remember where I was. It must have been New York, where I saw someone, it was on a bike with a cat on its head and some animal around his neck. I would say that was astonishing, jarring, bizarre, and a little uncomfortable, right? A little sense like, wow, this looks a little undignified, right? But there's something subjective. The bike rider clearly did not feel undignified. So part of the challenge we're going to have as we examine Kavod HaBeriyot is not everyone is embarrassed by the same thing. A 7th grade girl whose mother shows up to talk to her in front of all her friends is going to want the floor to open up in front of her and say, please don't talk to me when I'm with my friends. But a 25-year-old daughter is not going to feel the same way. evolve in our lives with regard to what embarrasses us, what causes us to feel undignified. And that's part of the reason there's going to be tension within the halacha. Halacha likes clarity, it likes definition. One more point before we get into the Yerushalmi. There is a known principle, pikuach nefesh toche hakol, except for, right? Threat to life overrides Jewish law, unless it's adultery, idolatry, murder. And I'm already going to say with idolatry, we have some wiggle room. Okay. We have clarity when it comes to medical situations. And because we know there can be a cascade effect, we're often erring on the side of caution when it comes to possible physical danger. So the reason I'm bringing up pikuach nefesh is because the principle of Kavod HaBeriyot comes very close to pikuach nefesh in the Yerushalmi. And that's why the Bavli is going to pull way back and say, no, we can't go that far. The Yerushalmi is going to suggest Kavod HaBeriyot is so significant for people that if you endanger their dignity, it's very close to killing them. It's a danger. There's a danger there. Those who have learned Baba Metzia not that long ago know the Talmud want to remind us, if you embarrass your friend, you have essentially killed them. Embarrassing someone publicly is akin to murder. If you humiliate them, you might as well be throwing them into a fiery pit. Now, that's very strong language. And I would like to suggest it's the reason in the next source, it's not Rabbi Zera, we'll see in a minute who it is going to, maybe it is Rabbi Zera, is going to say that Kavod HaBeriyot tochel lo taseh, threat to human dignity is going to override negative commandments. Right? It's serious, guys. We know that if you embarrass someone, it's akin to murder. But it's not pikuach nefesh, right? What do we do with that? Let's take a look at the Mishnah quickly. Eino asur mishum kilayim el etzemer upishtim. We're now getting into a conversation about kilayim, about what's called shatnez, more colloquially. It's what's called linsey woolsey. They used to make a lot of garments from wool and linen because they were very durable. So if you read Little House on the Prairie series or books of that nature, the little girls would wear linsey woolsey. And sometimes I think even the undergarments were made of that. Clearly it was a very durable and less expensive material. And so what we find out is kilayim, which are prohibited by the Torah, are made of linen and wool. And then we find out that if only linen and wool can become impure by tzara'at, right? Only they can have this category of clothing leprosy. We find out only wool and linen are worn by priests. Very interesting. What's prohibited outside of the temple is actually mandated in the temple. Not the first time we see that tension. If one mixed camel wool and sheep wool, so then it becomes a question. What about it? Normally wool is only from sheep. What if we throw in camel wool? Camel wool can't be kilayim. Okay, this is a Mishnah. We're just looking at some basic rules. The same applies if hemp and linen are mixed. Raw silk is not subject to kilayim, but it kind of looks like kilayim. So rabbinically, you shouldn't do it. Okay, we're going to move on. Oh, one more point. Mattresses and pillows are not subject to kilayim as long as you cover them with a pillowcase and with a blanket cover. Again, very, very odd law. It's about clothing. That's what it's about. But you can have them in your mattresses and pillows as long as it doesn't touch your skin. Okay, here we have a story, a case study in the Yerushalmi, and we're going to see it appear in the Bavli in a very different way. Harei shahaya mahalech bashuk v'nimtza levush kilayim. Someone is walking in the marketplace and they discover they're wearing kilayim. The problem in the time of the Talmud, people, is that there were no underwear in the way that we wear underwear. And if you take off your garment, you are literally going to be naked in the marketplace. They want to shine. I mean, it would be very easy if your overgarment has kilayim and you take it off and you have a bunch of layers. We all like to layer, or at least you have some underwear on. The idea here is you are stripping the person down to nothing because he is wearing a prohibited garment. Okay, and I want to shock us a little bit because nakedness is one of the prime categories of human dignity, of the antithesis of human dignity, and yet in this case study, it comes into conflict with a mitzvah in the Torah. Train Amoraim. There's a debate between the Amoraim. Chad Amar Asur, one says prohibited. The Charana Amar Mutar, the other one says it's permitted. Manda Amar Asur, Dvar Torah, the one who says you have to literally take it off in the marketplace. I don't care if you're going to be naked. It's in the Torah. It's a Deoraita. Manda Amar Mutar, the one who says he can continue walking and wearing this garment that is that's prohibited. Kahahida Amar Rabbi Zera. That was right. It's Rabbi Zera. Goes according to what Rabbi Zera said, and pay attention. Gadol Kavod Harabim Shuhu Doche et HaMitzvah B'lo Ta'aseh Sha'a Echad. Now, there's a variant here. In another tractate, it appears in the Yerushalmi as Gadol Kavod HaBeriyot. So which one is the more accurate, I can't tell you. Rabbi Zera is saying great is the public's dignity. Now, this becomes interesting because nakedness in the marketplace becomes an indignity not just for the individual, but for the entire society who are now forced to see something they don't want to see. So I want us to hold that lens as well. And he says it's dochem mitzvah b'lo ta'aseh sha'achad. Says you can override even a lo ta'aseh, a biblical commandment, for 1 hour. Temporarily, you lift up the lo ta'aseh in order to uphold the dignity, I'm going to use of the public. We'll get to human dignity, either to the person's dignity or to the public's dignity. Tane ein medaktakin b'taneh, ein medaktakin b'meit v'lo b'kilayim b'veit midrash. Now the Yerushalmi continues. Those who we'll see in the Bavli, it's a much more developed sugya. It has much more transition. The Yerushalmi is much pithier. It's shorter. It's sharper. It has edges. You have to kind of fill in the gaps. So we now have a statement that we don't go around investigating the shrouds of the dead to see if there are kilayim in them. And we don't start looking at other people's clothing in the Beit Midrash. Okay, I think that's probably a good idea. The idea of finding a mixture of linsey woolsey in a shroud and then just like stripping the dead body and being like, okay, we'll come back for you. Don't do that. Don't look for it. Ein medaktakin. And if you're in the Beit Midrash, don't start examining the collar of the guy next to you and seeing if his suit has shatnez, and don't even do it to yourself. Rabbi Yossi Yatev matne v'avetamen meta. Rabbi Yossi was sitting and he was teaching where there was a dead body, and he realized in the corner over there is a body. It's a little bit gruesome, I'm going to agree, but okay. He did not say anything to those who left. Rabbi Yossi, now the concern here is the Kohanim. If there are Kohanim and they're in the presence of a dead body, they're going to be, nitma, tumat mate. And basically he says, you don't go over and check and raise the alarm about the dead body. Ein medaktakin. It's going to cause a form of indignity. Okay, so we're going to keep going. Rav Imi, now I love this story. This story is where I really want to take us. Rav Imi Havayatev Matne Amar. Rav Imi was sitting there, Amar Chad B'Chavre, and he overhears one person say to the guy next to him, At Lavush Kilayim, you're wearing Kilayim, you got to take your clothes off. Amar Le Rav Imi, Shlach Manach V'Yavle, take off your clothes and give it to him. What are you doing? What are you telling him in the Beit Midrash? He's going to strip down, he's going to be naked. What are we supposed to do with that? What seichel, people, please, a little bit of seichel. So the Yerushalmi really leans into Rabbi Zera's comment, which you can temporarily override a negative commandment in order to uphold dignity and to avoid defilement of Kohanim. Okay, that's not the topic I'm interested in, but interesting. So Rav Imi turns to the guy and is like, what are you doing? Why are you telling him here? At least wait till you walk him home and tell him as he enters his house. Like, what are you doing? That story is going to appear in Menachot in the Bavli with two Babylonian Amoraim. But I want us to, we have a statement, Rabbi Zera, Gadol Kavod HaBeriyot. Human dignity is great enough to override a negative commandment temporarily. It's very close to Pikuach Nefesh. It's very close to Pikuach Nefesh. This idea that, because with Pikuach Nefesh as well, we don't override every Shabbat to save a life for an individual. We do it when his life is in danger. We do it when a woman goes into labor. It's also sha'a achad, right? It's also 1 hour temporarily. And Rav Zera is using the same entry point to categorize indignity. The Bavli is not going to be happy with this. We're going to see. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said. Now, this is a very long sugya. I'm really going to go through it somewhat quickly, but it's important to see the touch points here. When we emerge on the other side, we're going to do something a little, we're going to get to a story. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, one who discovers kilayim, that's where we are, in his garment, must remove them in the marketplace. Okay, so we have a statement in the name of Rav Yehuda. He's an Amora in Bavel. In the name of Rav, one of the greatest of the earliest sages, although usually Rav Yehuda quotes Shmuel, here he's quoting Rav. And Rav is very clear. If you discover kilayim in your clothing, you have to remove them in the marketplace, even though it's going to render you unclothed or naked. Why? And now I'll quote the pasuk. I have the Hebrew. I didn't want to have both languages here. Ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna ve'ein etza leneged Hashem. There is neither wisdom nor understanding nor counsel against the Lord. Anywhere God's name can be desecrated, kol makom sheyesh chilul Hashem, ein cholkin kvod darav. You don't give respect to the teacher, meaning the human. So what can we do? There is a deoraita. And what? He's now going to be undignified. But what does that have? This is God's law. Ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna ve'ein etza leneged Hashem. Yes, you're right. You're going to be undignified in the marketplace, but there's no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord. That is just fact. The Gemara raises an objection. The Gemara is now going to go through, I think, 5 or 6 attempts to argue against this idea of Rav. That human dignity is not overridden by a lo ta'aseh. That's what we're about to get into. So we started off with a shocking example that you remove your corrupted garment in the marketplace because there's human dignity and there's God's dignity. And to be quite frank, God's dignity overrides human dignity. What can you do? After they buried the deceased, we're going to try over and over again, and you're going to see where the Bavli is going to take us to. Very important to get to where the Bavli takes us. They're going to try to find other situations where it seems like dignity overrides a negative commandment. Remember, in the background, we have Rabbi Zera and the Yerushalmi. He was really clear. Gadol Kavod Harabim or Kavod HaBeriyot. There are 2 variants. Shedoche lo ta'aseh b'Torah sha'achat. That it overrides a negative commandment, which means a doraita, negative prohibition for which you're chayav malchus, right? If you're doing makot, you know that's all about that. And it overrides it temporarily. So it's in the background. After they bury the deceased and return, they're following the mourners back to their home. The deceased has been buried, and there's not just a practice, a mitzvah, a positive mitzvah to accompany the mourners. There are 2 paths. One is pure and one is not pure. One is tameh, one is tahor. It passes through a cemetery. So if the mourner, who's already tameh, of course, because he or she have buried their dead, goes on the pure path, they follow him. If he goes on the impure path, they follow him. Wait, what? You're deliberately going to mitameh yourself? You're not supposed to do that. So, and it includes if there are kohanim, because most of us can be tameh and are tameh. It's talking about the kohen. Ein chokhmah ve'ein tfuna ve'ein etza leneged Hashem. No, yeah, that's what, right. What do you do? Maybe the Gemara says, how can you allow them to go on the impure path and defile themselves. We're talking about Kohanim here. So what if you're trying to give dignity to the mourner? That doesn't justify. And so Rav Abba then says it's talking about a path that is a suffix. There's uncertainty. Now it's only rabbinic law. Now I want you to remember that. That's going to be the punchline for every case. Every time we try to find a situation where we prove that Rabbi Zera's principle in fact is correct, that human dignity is overridden by Kavod HaBeriyot, Kavod HaBeriyot overrides a lo ta'aseh, a negative commandment. Every time they're going to narrow it to rabbinic law. Okay, it's very, very deliberate. It happens in other places in the Talmud as well. We found a situation where you override human dignity for Kavod HaBeriyot. You override a negative commandment for Kavod HaBeriyot. No. Only a rabbinic situation, not a biblical. That's what we're going to be doing over and over, but I want to show you where we're getting to. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, who was a priest, he's a Kohen, he says, I and my fellow Kohanim would jump over coffins in order to hurry towards Malchei Yisrael, the kings of Israel. And not only the kings of Israel, we would literally hop, skip, and jump over the coffins of the deceased, getting very close to death tumah, becoming tameh, in order to give honor to the kings of Israel and even to the monarchs of the nations of the world. So that if one will be privileged to witness the redemption of Israel, he'll distinguish between kings of Israel and kings of the nations of the world. That's how Rav Tzadok Elazar explains it. Wait a minute, what are you talking about? You're deliberately impurifying yourself? You're deliberately, you the Kohen, contracting tumah? You're not allowed to do that. We know Kohanim are not allowed into the cemetery. Let us say, yes, so there's the dignity of the king, and there's a law to refrain from impurity. There's a transgression if the priest becomes impure. So the dignity of the human king is going to be greater than the dignity of Melech Malchei Amlachim, the king of all kings. The Gemara says, well, maybe what we're talking about is there's some sort of, I think I left this, no, there's a space between the body and the top of the coffin of the ossuary, most likely, the body and the top, and then it's only rabbinic impurity, right? So Rabbi Elazar brings a really clear situation where he is deliberately incurring biblical tumah, not for any of the reasons permitted, in order to honor, to bring dignity to the kings of Israel and the nations of the world. And the Gemara pauses, and then they say, no, that's not biblical impurity. It's only rabbinic impurity. The ossuaries are such that there's enough of a gap between where the body or the bones are and the top of the coffin. No, it's okay. It's just rabbinic. Phew. Moving on. Great is here. So now we have another situation. Hold on. Oh, yes. Come in here. Tashma. Great is human dignity. They now quote the Yerushalmi. Finally, we're quoting the Yerushalmi. We did not start with it. We've already had 3 different scenarios. We've had nakedness. We have the mourners that we are accompanying in order to give them dignity as they bury their dead. And we have Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok hop, skipping, and jumping. I find it a little humorous, over the coffins in order to greet the kings. All of that, so far, for the second and the third, we have downgraded them to violating rabbinic law. Now the Bavli is ready to bring us the Yerushalmi. Let us say here, it's great as human dignity as it overrides a prohibition in the Torah. The Gemara asks, why? Let us say, again, ein chochma ve'ein tfuna ve'ein eitzah l'neged Hashem. You cannot do that. God's dignity is greater than human dignity. How could we have this principle? How could the Yerushalmi say this? Rav Bar Shaba interpreted before Rav Kahana, and this is where I wanted to get us to, and we're going to move on shortly. He says, there's a mitzvah in the Torah. According to the Torah taught to you and the ruling handed down to you, you shall not deviate to the left or the right from that which they tell you. Rav Bar Shaba comes up with a reconciliation. There is a mitzvah in the Torah not to deviate from what the sages tell you. So essentially, when Rav Zera says, great is in human dignity as it overrides a prohibition in the Torah, it's not talking about Shabbat or Kashrut or tum'ah, impurity. It's talking about rabbinic law, which is a mitzvah in the Torah to follow rabbinic law. That prohibition can be overridden. That's what the Yerushalmi is saying. So midway through, and it's going to continue on and on and on, but midway through, and I'll read it, I'll make sure it's clear, a discussion where there's this tension. Can you override a negative commandment to preserve human dignity? And the Bavli shows, no, only rabbinic law, that's only rabbinic law, that's another case of rabbinic law. They now say, come in here. They quote the Yerushalmi, and they downgrade that statement to the pasuk in the Torah, the verse in the Torah that is about rabbinic law. Right? It's actually brilliant. And what do they say here? Rav Kahana says, a great man has spoken. Here, the yeshiva students laughed at him, as the prohibition of you shall not deviate is by Torah law, like other mitzvot. Why should human dignity override it any more than any other Torah prohibition? And Rav Kahana then says, and this is very important, a great man has spoken, meaning Rabbi Zera, the opening, come in here, greatest human dignity as it overrides a prohibition. Rav Bar Shaba tries to defend it. His fellow students laugh at him, and they're all in front of the great stage Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says, guys, stop laughing. That's not appropriate. Rav Zera is a great sage. He has spoken. And the sages based all rabbinic law on the prohibition, you shall not deviate. However, due to concern for human dignity, the sages permit suspension of rabbinic law in cases where the two collide. The Bavli basically says, normally, all of us are commanded biblically to follow rabbinic law. It's a mitzvah in the Torah. It's what gives authority to rabbinic law, that the Torah says do not deviate. Nonetheless, rabbinic law is not on equal footing with biblical law. And so they take the statement of Rabbi Zera, they take Rav Bar Shaba's interpretation, and Rav Kahana says, this is where it's at. This is where we're going to allow it to reside in the area or the realm of rabbinic law. All rabbinic decrees are predicated on the mitzvah in the Torah to heed the judges, never stray. Therefore, when the sages suspend a decree in the interest of preserving human dignity is overriding a Torah prohibition. But only one Torah prohibition, the Torah prohibition not to deviate from what the rabbis tell you to do. The next examples I'm going to do very quickly, we're not going to look at inside. It says here, with regard to returning a lost object, this to me is important because it illustrates this idea of dignity as an experience, not as something objective. You're not supposed to see the ox or sheep of your brother and ignore it. There's a mitzvah hashavat aveda, return them to your brother. So the Braita says something's extraneous and disregard them. This idea, you shall not see the ox of your brother or his sheep go astray, return them to your brother. That's the way the pasuk should read. Why does it add and ignore them or and disregard them? That's extraneous. And what they answer, there are times you disregard lost objects and violate the mitzvah, and at times you do not. And who gets to disregard lost objects? A priest who would have to go into the cemetery, right, in order to preserve his dignity of being tahor. Go getting the lost object from the cemetery would be degrading, or an elder. This to me is very interesting. The idea that you're going to take a zaken. I'm not just talking about because he's physically infirm, because there would be something, whenever you see someone, when it doesn't look like they're going to be able to complete the task, everyone in the room gets very nervous, right? There's perhaps maybe even a kvod harabim, dignity to the public. The idea that if we may see an elder begin to bend down or pursue the sheep, it will look undignified for him, as opposed to a young, strapping 20-year-old soldier, right? Where we're like, oh yeah, clap your hands. You see someone who doesn't look capable of the act, and everyone begins to look and stare and hold their breath. The Gemara here says that's indignity. And so a zaken, however we want to define it, is patur, is exempted, is allowed to ignore a clear mitzvah in the Torah because of Kavod HaBeriyot, because of human dignities. We have another example that's a little bit different. The last one is you are allowed to become impure for a mate mitzvah, no matter what, and because you want to preserve the human dignity of the anonymous body, a mate mitzvah is a body that is discovered and has no one to bury it, that everyone is allowed to bury, even if you're on your way to bring your Korban Pesach, your Passover offering, and you're going to be impure and not be able to bring it, you're allowed to do that in order to preserve the dignity of the dead. Okay, so engaging, I'll just read this last piece, in the burial of a mate mitzvah is not actually in contravention of a mitzvah. Rather, by doing so, he becomes ritually impure and is incapable of fulfilling his mitzvah. But we can't derive here a general principle, right, where human dignity overrides a Torah prohibition, because really there's also a mitzvah to bury the mate mitzvah. And if that comes into tension with a positive commandment, so be it. That's not the same thing as allowing you to eat not kosher or violate Shabbat or do any of the other negative commandments we read about in the Torah. So to summarize, because I know that was a bit exhausting, but to summarize, the Bavli from the very opening is very uncomfortable with how far Kavod HaBeriyot can be extended. It recognizes there's a subjective experience of indignity that can be very hard to define, maintain, control. And so it downgrades the statement of Rabbi Zera in the Yerushalmi to rabbinic law only. I'm going to keep Rabbi Zera in the background. We'll see he comes back again in other ways, but Rabbi Zera is talking about in the Torah. I want to be like, that's the split, Bavli Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is willing to go as far as overriding a Doraita. The Bavli, every time Kavod HaBeriyot comes up, every single time, proves that whatever test cases is, it is only a test case of rabbinic law. There is no violation of biblical law. That's going to become the dominant position. I want to bring there are a few stories, a few examples that I think are relevant, and with this we'll close and we'll be ready for next week, where we'll start looking at some really interesting stories that appear in the responsa literature. The Mishnah teaches, now we're talking about tzitzit. We're going to be talking about also possible nakedness in the public space, in the market. Rabbi Yishmael says, all four fringes are independent mitzvot, and Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, the halacha is like Rabbi Yishmael, and the Gemara says no, it's not. I always love that. Halakha is in the name of Rabbi Yishmael. Nope. That's not the way we paskined. So Rabbi Yishmael is basically saying each fringe is its own mitzvah. So if one would fall off, you're still doing 3 mitzvot. The dominant opinion is you have to have all 4. If you don't have all 4 fringes, you're not wearing tzitzit. Ravina was walking behind Mar Rav Ashi on the Shabbat of the festival. It's Shabbat of the Moed. When the corner of Mari Bar Rav Ashi's garment tore, and so now he's not wearing kosher tzitzit. I'm going to go even further. Because they're not kosher tzitzit, there might be a muktzah problem of actually continuing to wear the garment because there's no use for them and they're not kosher. Ravina did not say anything. Now they're in the public space. There would be 2 issues here. Number 1, taking off your garment. Number 2, what are you carrying? Are you not carrying? If you're wearing these fringes and they're no longer tzitzit, are you carrying them in some way? Is there muktzah here? You're in Reshut HaRabim. Ravina did not say anything. When he arrived at Mar Bar Rav Ashi's house, Ravina said to him, back there, the corner tore. Mar Bar Rav Ashi says, if you would have told me, I would have thrown off my garment then and there. As once one of the ritual fringes is torn, there's no mitzvah, and it's prohibited to walk in the Reshut HaRabim with such a garment. It seems to be he's concerned for carrying, because that would be a doraita. And so now what we encounter are 2 people who have 2 different experiences of what it would mean to be unclothed in the marketplace. Mar Bar Rav Ashi says, Ein chokhmah, ein tvuna, ve'ein etzah l'neged Hashem. He doesn't say it explicitly, but he's basically saying my dignity and God's dignity, I'm going to choose God. Even if it means I'm going to end up walking home, possibly with nothing. Because again, they wore these robes. They didn't have undergarments. Ravina thinks that's unthinkable. He would never tell his friend in the marketplace. He, like Rabbi Zera in the Yerushalmi, says, I'm going to wait till you get home and then I'll tell you. I don't want to take off my clothing and give it to you, as Rav Imi suggested. I'm going to wait. the Bavli, as I told you, every single time this comes up, the Bavli assures us that obviously we're not talking about overriding Torah law. We're not in a real Reshut Harabim. We're not in a real public space. We're in what's called a Carmelite. We're in like a rabbinic space where it's prohibited to carry. So we're not going to go into that. But again, they downgrade it from biblical to rabbinic. In the second version of the story, which I love when they bring two versions, it ties into a lecture I gave yesterday, How Do We Tell Stories? In the second version, Mar bar Rav Ashi's garment tears, and Ravina tells him on the spot. And Mar bar Rav Ashi is like, what do you want me to do? Take off my clothing? Are you out of your mind? And so here Ravina is like, I don't know, I would have wanted to take off my clothing, right? So we see there's something subjective about dignity. And while one person might want to take off their clothing and maybe bump up against Rabbi Zera saying, what about the public who don't really want to see you undressed and it brings undignity to us? Other people are going to say, please don't tell me till I get home. And in order to make, and as I said, in the end, they say, no, of course, there won't be a prohibition d'oraita, it would be Carmelite, it's rabbinic, etc. That doesn't matter. What I'm interested there in the story, which I think is a very important story, is the experience of dignity is a subjective experience. And in both versions of the story, each sage respond the way they would have responded if it had been them. But it's not the way their colleague would have responded. That's where we get a little bit sticky and murky and things get unclear. I'm going to follow it up with a shoot that appears in the Maharam of Rottenburg. I'm going now to really the 13th century, if I'm not mistaken. A question from my son. If one of the fringes falls off, now we're no longer talking about a garment that covers nakedness, right? In the time of the Talmud, you would have been wearing your four-cornered garment as a robe, not a additional garment. And by the way, your talit might be a blanket with fringes, right? Like with tzitzit. Things change a lot between 500 CE and now we're in the 1300s in Germany. At this point, people would go to shul and there would be talitot hanging there. And it seems to me from the little research I did, not everyone owned a talit and the shul would have talitot and you couldn't carry them necessarily, although it seems like some people actually wore their talit. It's a different Halakhic question. And a person shows up in shul and he discovers that the talit he takes from the pile, the last one say, is missing a fringe. And he wants to know if he can put it on anyway, or maybe it's muktzah and it's prohibited. And can he make a bracha? And so the answer is that he can't make a bracha. But look at what the Maharam says. If a person went to synagogue and found a talit that had a fringe missing and was not thus fringed properly according to halakha, so really it's muktzah on Shabbat, it's you can't wear it, but is embarrassed to change his custom and sit before the congregation without a talit, it is possible he'd be allowed to wrap himself without a bracha. And then he cites the source in Menachot. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and we talked about how embarrassing it would be for a married man to come to shul and not wear, right? Everyone will, in a shul where only married men wear talits, and then not wear a talit, and everyone's going to come up to him, hey, what happened to your talit? Hey, what happened to our talit? The Maharam saying, if you're going to be embarrassed and you don't want to stand out, then wrap yourself in the talit, hide the part, right? Do it in a way that it's hidden, no one sees, that there's a fringe missing, and then you can feel comfortable and not that everyone's looking at you. And when I talked to my colleague, she said something very funny, and again, this speaks to the subjectivity. She said if it was her husband, he'd have no problem. He'd be like, okay, I can't wear a talit. But she would be embarrassed. She would look down from the women's section and say, I'm embarrassed. My husband's sitting there without a talit as if he's a single macher. So embarrassment can sometimes be not just about the person themselves, but the impact it has on those who see them, right? So again, we're speaking about subjectivity. The Maharam is sensitive, not to nakedness, not to bathroom uncleanliness, not to the burial of the dead, but to the very personal experience of humiliation and shame. I'm going to have to skip a little bit. I just want to get to two more examples. The Rishonim have very interesting discussion, and basically they say if you as an individual discover you're wearing kilayim, you have to take it off, but your friend does not have to tell you. right? And so very interesting. Very quickly, when it comes to the bathroom, we find out what if you are outside of the Tchum, outside of the Shabbat boundary, you've been taken there by Gentiles or an evil spirit, and you have to go to the bathroom. You're only allowed 4 cubits. You can't leave. Once you leave the Shabbat boundary, you basically can't move. I mean, if they're forcing you, dragging you, you can. But if they say, stay here, you actually are now limited to 4 amot, which is very, very, 4 arms breadths. But you have to go to the bathroom. And you don't really want to go to the bathroom in your 4 hands breadths, meaning leaving your waist right where you can see it and experience it is really undignified and uncomfortable. And so basically they say, well, you can, gadol kvod HaBeriyot. If you have to, gadol kvod HaBeriyot shetochel lo taseh shebat Torah. It's so important you can override a negative commandment. And what does the Bavli do? No. It's only rabbinic law. It's not like moving from a public space to a private space. This is just within like a space where the rabbis restricted you. So again, the punchline is always, we implement the principle of human dignity is great. It overrides a negative commandment in rabbinic law. Right? That's constantly what's going to be happening. But here we begin to see this idea of going to the bathroom, having privacy, having somewhere to dispose of your waste is so fundamental, you're allowed to override rabbinic law on Shabbat. Okay. This comes up in Shabbat 81a. What if I have to go up and carry stones? They use stones, not toilet paper. They didn't have Rav Lichtenstein running after them with a bag of toilet paper. They had to use flat stones. They have a lot of hemorrhoids in the time of the Talmud, unfortunately. And they want to know if they can bring them up to the roof. And it seems like here too, we have a situation possible carrying, possible you didn't prepare the stones before Shabbat, which is a big deal. Again, gadol kvod HaBeriyot. You are allowed to cleanse yourself after using the bathroom. This touches on a big question. What happens if you're in the lavatory and there's no ripped toilet paper? The reason you're allowed to rip toilet paper if you end up in that situation is based very much on this discussion in the Talmud, that the idea of not being able to cleanse yourself after after going to the bathroom is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. It's so unthinkable. You'll walk out and all you'll think about is everyone knows, everyone sees, everyone can tell. So that's another example that comes up. The last one in the 2 minutes I have left is about the idea of a body is discovered in Daruka. It's out in outside and it's rotting in the sun, lo aleinu, or it's lying in disgrace. Are you allowed to bring it inside? This to me touches both on Kvod HaRabim and Kvod HaBeriyot. It certainly is indignity for people to walk by, both for the dead body and for the humans around who we know how jarring it is to see sometimes a dead dog at the side of the road. You want to avert your eyes. It's so uncomfortable and hard to look at. Imagine a human body. And so you're allowed to bring it inside. And here the Bavli again rushes to tell us you're not really carrying from a public space to a private space, which would be a violation of biblical law. The story is about rabbinic law. I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that we would leave a dead body out, even if it were to violate a biblical law, but you would have to ask a rabbi. If it's rabbinic, you know you can do it on your own. So just to summarize, what we've seen is the development of this principle, the idea that there is such a principle, that appears repeatedly throughout the Talmudic discourse, but the concern that it can become too big, given how subjective the experience of dignity is, leads the Bavli to really restrict it to only rabbinic law, which is actually a major restriction. Okay, and so I'm going to say, stay tuned. We're going to begin to look at next week case studies where rabbis apply the principle of human dignity as a way of lifting up the Halakhic framework and some of the consequences that they suffer as a result. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope it was clear. You're welcome to email me. I hope my email, Jay, is my email on a site with questions. There isn't time.
No, we didn't. We don't put emails on unless, people, give us permission. We never give out emails of our speakers.
Oh, okay.
If you want to give it to me or put it in the chat box, I'm happy to do that. Or people send me, we always forward emails.
It's Nechama Barash at Gmail if you have any questions, but I hope that was clear and that you enjoyed and that you will be back next week. I look forward to seeing you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you.
Hold on. Any questions? If you have a minute or two,
clarity, yes, a minute or two if someone has something they want to add.
Okay, before you ask a question, I just want to point, because people leave, I just posted, I forgot to mention, the Nechama mentioned right at the beginning, we're going to do for Rev Lichtenstein's 10th Yortzeit. We put this together basically last night and this morning. And tomorrow's the 10th Yortzeit. Wednesday, Thursday, of course, are Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut. So tomorrow, Rabbi Shulman will not be giving a class. I spoke to him. He's very happy. He's to push it off a week. At 12:30, Rabbi Eli Fisher lives in Modi'in. We'll be giving a reflections on Rav Aaron, and then at 1:15, Gila Rosen, Rabbanit Gila Rosen, both of whom are Talmidim. She actually attended his shir in the Gris Kola, which says a lot about Rav Aaron. Where at Gris Kola is the YU Smicha program, and so they will both be speaking from 12:30 to 2 on Rav Lichtenstein on his 10th Yortzeit. And then right after that, at 2:15, we're beginning a three-part series. Rachel Sharansky Danziger is beginning a three-part series. She just wrote a book, As Nashir, on new prayers for Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim. So we missed Yom HaShoah, so she'll be giving tomorrow. We planned that at 2:15 because Rabbi Shulman normally speaks from 1 to 2, she'll be starting a three-part series tomorrow on we've done new tefillot, so tomorrow will be Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. So I put the links to both of those programs just in the chat box and we hope you can make it. For those who don't know, we're never exposed to Rav Aaron. He really was very special, and that's there's a lot to say. I spoke about it after my shir on Friday. Those who are at my shir, and please welcome to come. Okay. All right, I think Nechama left. Okay, thank you very much, and everybody. And then tonight, of course, Dr. Shapiro's back. Mark Shapiro's back, continuing his series on the Langer Fair. And like I say, Rabbi Shulman will continue next Tuesday. I told him it's okay, it's open-ended. He'll just go another week or whatever until he finishes. All right, everybody. Appropriate to use chat as I have today. I don't understand. You're just think. Okay.
Yeah, I had a few questions and observations.
Yeah, but okay, Nechama just wrote she had to leave, so I'm sorry, but okay, I'll tell her next week to stop 5 minutes early. Take any questions. You can ask her next week.
Thank you.
Okay.